Is it time to start? All right. What separates us from a relationship with God? Are we too busy, too fatigued, too lazy, too many distractions, too many sporting events, too many television shows? I'm just meddling now, huh? Is it shame, disappointment, bitterness, regret, condemnation, guilt, pride, embarrassment, humiliation, fear, anger? What are we to do when our minds become filled with thoughts we cannot stop? Is there a way to stop those thoughts, or do we simply have to live with them? The name of this message is A Captive Mind. All right, so please stand and cover yourselves for the reading of today's scripture. For those of you who don't know, I'm tethered. I can't move, so it's not a command by God. You don't actually have to stand. You don't actually have to cover yourself. But it is something that Yeshua and all his Talmudim, for the uninitiated, that's Jesus and his disciples, they all did it. And the disciples of the disciples did it, and the disciples of the disciples did it. But after that, we don't know for sure. But this is something that they did. All right, so we try to follow Yeshua, at least this group does, as closely as we possibly can. And since this is what he did, this is what we do. Again, it's not a commandment. No one's going to look down on you if you can't do it. Some people are broken down in the hips and the knees and the ankles and the whatnot and just can't do it. That's fine. We understand. Nobody's judging anybody here. It's just that's why we do it. And so no one's concerned with whether you're doing it, when they are. Forget it. Anyway, here's our verse. It's Meshalim, which is Proverbs. By the way, that's mashal, parable. Hear it? Mashal is the singular. Meshalim is parables. Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 5. It says it this way in Hebrew: Yishma hacham ve'yosef lekach ve'navon tachbulot yikne. All right, you may be seated. All right, so our first word, again, we're looking at the parable, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 5. Our first word is, did you ever stop and think about that? Proverbs are parables. So we're looking at the first parable, verse 5. Proverbs 1, 5. Anyway, our first word is Yishma. Does it sound familiar? Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Hear. It's to hear, especially to listen, though. It's to attend to any person or thing, to attend to any person or thing. Well, where does that come from? What's it have to do with serving somebody? Because that's what attend to any person or thing is. Well, if I say, hey, y'all, I'm thirsty, somebody needs to attend to my need. Anyway, that's where that idea comes from anyway. So it's to attend to somebody, it's to hear anyone, to hear an answer, to obey, to give heed, to understand things heard. It really boils down to this. In English, we can say, I'm thirsty, and everybody that's within the sound of my voice, everybody watching this broadcast or watching it after it's been broadcast via, the internet or some DVD, you've heard what I said. I said I'm thirsty, and everybody's like, okay, I heard you. But see, in Hebrew, it doesn't work that way. In Hebrew, you have to hear it with your ear, which everybody would agree we've all done. Then it's to understand with your whole heart and mind. Because see, in Hebrew, the heart and the mind, the soul, the body, not the body, but the soul, the spirit, the heart, the mind, all of that's one thing. Just one thing. When the Bible starts talking about love God with all your heart and your soul and your strength, that's not three different things. It's not three bullet points. We don't look up three different words and give you the explanation of three different things. No, that's Western. It has nothing to do with the Bible. Nothing. This is philosophy. This is Plato. That's what that is. In the Bible, they say things like love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole strength. That's one thing. And why are they saying it in three different ways? Because that's in Hebrew how you put an exclamation point at the end of a sentence. So you hear with the heart and the mind. That's one thing. If your heart says yes, your mind says no, you are suffering in biblical time, in the biblical way of thought. You are suffering from a condition called schizophrenia. Anyway, so you hear with your whole heart and mind. First, you hear with your ear, then you understand it with your whole heart and mind. But the most important part is that you act upon it. You have to do something. So, when I say I'm thirsty, somebody needs to get up and get me something to drink, or somebody needs to say, why don't you go get something to drink? That's a reaction, is it not? Yes, it is. Or you can just completely ignore me, which you could say is an action. But in Hebrew, if you ignore me, then you haven't heard me. See, there has to be an actual action. Ignoring is not an action. All right, so let me give you a real world example. Somebody sends you an email, you don't want to discuss what they're wanting to discuss, you don't want to get involved. Maybe you've told someone you're going to do something for them. Like this young man, he did something. He told me that for $300 he could get the rock poured in my driveway, and he could come out with his grandpa's tractor and he could straighten it all out. So when I began to try to contact him via email and text messages, all of a sudden his phone and his computer didn't work. How many times have you done that? Ignore some email or text message because you didn't want to deal with it? Well, you haven't heard. Because if you would have heard, you would have acted upon it. The boy would have written me back and said, I'm so sorry. When I looked into it, I found out that I couldn't get the rock for less than $500, which is why he ignored me. He had way underbid the job, and rather than just tell me he had underbid the job, he ignored me. So he didn't hear me. Think about that the next time you do that to somebody, because it's not till I observe it. Anyway, so our next word is haham, and that's wisdom. It's intelligence. It's endued with reason and using it. But see, in the biblical world, you couldn't have the skill of reason without knowledge. So think about it. Think about how a child reasons. When you go to the grocery store and there's some child screaming and crying and boohooing, he's doing that because the parent or somebody in that child's life has taught that child, this is how you reason. This is how you get what you want. This is how you get your point across. You start screaming and kicking and throwing a fit and boohooing. Yes, they learn that almost 100% of the time from mom and dad. Mom and dad taught them. How do they teach them that? Well, they say no, 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 and then they finally give in and say, okay, fine, just shut up. So what have they done? They've taught that child that behavior that they don't like is the way that child negotiates for what that child wants. It's the parent's fault. Anyway, but think about how a child reasons. They'll cry, they'll make noise, they'll point at things. It's not based on a lot of knowledge, right? And so as we get older, we're supposed to gain knowledge. We gain knowledge in how to speak the language. We gain knowledge in how to negotiate because it's based on something, right? And so when you get to ha-hum, you're talking about knowledge that's based on you're talking about wisdom that is based on something worthwhile, knowledge. There's a commercial that I saw just yesterday. I've seen it before, but I haven't seen it in a while. And yesterday, there's this commercial. This guy says, I'm really into this car, but I don't know if I'd be paying too much. Oh, get this app and put it on your phone, and it'll make you an instant expert. No, it won't. No, it will not. You will not be an instant expert. This is not your knowledge. You can't look things up on Wikipedia and pretend to be an expert on something. Well, I mean, everybody does it these days, but that doesn't make you an expert. That doesn't make you somebody that people ought to listen to on some point, right? That's not the way it works in the real world, to tell you the truth. The real world doesn't work that way, and God's world didn't work that way. If you were intelligent, it was because you were educated. If you were endowed with reason and using it, it was because you had education. It was wisdom from experience of life, of course. I mean, you're going to learn things from life. Touch something hot, you're gonna know next time not to touch that hot thing, right? So there is a certain amount that comes from life, but this word is used of skilled craftsmen, not of somebody who has just been working for a carpenter for a year or two or three, not of somebody who's been following the teaching of some man for a year or two or three. This is skilled craftsmen. This is somebody who went to, to put it in educational terms, if you're going to call yourself a Bible scholar, if you're going to pass yourself off as a Bible scholar, people do it inadvertently. I watched, what's his name, do it yesterday. I can't think of his name. He's got a TV show, and he's always talking well, not conspiracy so much as just all doom and gloom. Glenn Beck, I couldn't think of the guy's name. Yesterday he's up there. Where does anger come from? Does it come from God? Yeah, it does. Doesn't God get angry? Yes, he's slow to get angry, but he does get angry. And if we're created in God's image, where does anger come from? It does not come from the devil. It comes from God. How we deal with it is based on our knowledge of God's law, hopefully. But if it's not based on God's law, then we're not dealing with it correctly, right? And he set himself up as a Bible scholar yesterday, and everything he said about the Bible, everything he said about the Bible was wrong because he doesn't actually know. He read the Bible once, and now he thinks he knows everything. That is typical Western way of doing things. It is not the way it was done in the Bible. Somebody like that who would stand up before a camera, before a crowd, and say what he said yesterday, in the biblical period would have been called an idiot, because he's speaking out about things for which he does not know. He has not gone to school. He has not been educated. And somebody who tells you that he can build this finely crafted cabinet for your house that's never done anything but frame a building, well, he's an idiot. Now, he may build something that you look at and say, well, that's pretty good, because even idiots like me, I'm an idiot wood craftsman. I've come out pretty good a couple of times. We get lucky. Sometimes it actually does what it's supposed to do, and it looks good too. But that doesn't make me a skilled craftsman. I am not. I'm just a tinkerer, if you will, which is why I don't do it for a living, because we would starve to death. But anyway. This is somebody who's skilled. This is somebody who has the knowledge from the training. You don't become a skilled craftsman without training. Now, if you train yourself, you can become pretty good. But you would never be considered a skilled craftsman. They would not call you a master in the Bible world if you taught yourself. No. If you're going to be a skilled craftsman, if you're going to be a master, it comes through education. That's the way it always is in the Bible. Everything is based on that. And Haham is our word. It's of a wise craftsman, somebody who is educated in something beyond just a primitive knowledge, beyond looking it up on Google or Wikipedia or someplace like that. This is the real deal. All right, that's a long way to go for no more than what I just said. Our next word is Yosef. Sounds like Yosef, the guy's name. Well, it's increase. It's to add to something, or to do it again, to do something after something. So it's used of 2 plus 2 becomes 4, right? Unless you're doing Common Core, then it could be anything, 34, 27, who knows. But in the real world, it's going to be 4, right? Because it has increased. That word is used in that way. But it's also used of, I walked up the mountain and the guy, and Joey walked behind me. because he was after me. He was behind me. He came up right after I got there. And instead of doing something over and over again, I walked in, I was going to go to the kitchen to turn the light off. And I went to the kitchen and I got a sandwich. And then I remembered I was going to turn the light off, so I went to the kitchen and I got something to drink. And then remembered I was going to turn the light off, and I went to doing it again and again. This word is used all three ways. So you have to look at the context of the sentence to know which way this word is being used. Then it's followed by lekach, which is learning. It's doctrine, and it's knowledge. Of course, if you've learned a doctrine, if you've learned something, then of course that's going to be associated with knowledge. But it's of knowledge which is received. It's knowledge which is learned. In other words, it's instructor led. It's to receive and to learn so far as this is communicated to others. In other words, instruction, the discourse of one who teaches. So you get what's going on here. This word is knowledge that has been gained via a teacher. Someone has taught somebody something else. It's not knowledge that you've gained for yourself. It is from the root lakach, which is to take, to stick together, to adhere, to take for oneself, to take, to receive. Okay, this word is used more often of a married couple, to take a bride in marriage, to take one to yourself. You should think of this word, this root word, as to stick together like glue. So when you think of it in terms of knowledge, if we're discussing something in terms of knowledge, then it's. I had a friend that people used to say about him, his mind was like a steel trap. If anyone ever said something, he never forgot it. If he ever read something, he never forgot it. It's like a steel trap. The information stuck to him like glue. That's the idea. But used of somebody in a relationship, this is of two becoming one. They stick together like glue. They're inseparable. They can finish each other's sentences, that kind of thing. All right. So then that's followed by venavon, which is and understand. It's to distinguish, to separate, to stand apart, to be separate and distinct. Metaphorically, to be easily distinguished, distinct, manifest, hence to consider, to understand, which depends, of course, upon the power of discerning. To discern, to perceive with the eyes, which is to see, with the ears, to hear, and with the touch, to feel. Everywhere it signifies some counsel and purpose, to turn the mind to something, to attend to it. You remember that? To understand, to regard as a thing understood, to know, to be acquainted with, to have understanding. Wow, we went all over the place with that one, right? Understanding. So what do they mean by separating? Oh, well, we take the words and we separate them out. And we look up no, 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 no. For you to understand something and to be able to, you distinguish that this way of thinking existed among the Jews of the first century. This way of thinking existed among the Jews in the 4th century, in the 6th century, in the 12th century, because patterns of thought, ways of writings, patterns of speech, that changes over time. And that's how people can date things. They can look at the way it was written and say, well, they wrote that way, that writing style was used in the 6th century AD, or it was used in the 12th century BC. I mean, you can know these things by that because you can distinguish them. You distinguish it because you have the knowledge of it. I read books all of the time where people are taking information that didn't exist until, say, the 9th century, and they shove it all the way back to the 1st century, or they shove it all the way back to the time of Moshe. I'll give you an example. Hanukkah, we just celebrated that last month, right? And there are people that run around talking about, oh, yeah, well, there was this miracle of lights, and the Maccabees decided, since they're the oil lasted for 8 days, that they should have this, that they made a rule that everybody had to celebrate Hanukkah every year after that. Well, you realize that that story didn't exist until the 9th century CE or AD, for those who don't know what CE is. CE is just a politically correct way to say AD. But 900 years after the event that's 1,000 years after the event took place. Little over 1,000 years after the event takes place, somebody comes up with this story. And now, most Jews in this world, and even non-Jews, believe that there really was this miracle of lights, and that the reason why the Maccabees made this rule was because of the miracle of lights. You see where I'm going with this? So you take things from the wrong century and you put it in the wrong century, it changes history. Just like when you read your English Bible, it says that they were first called Christians at Antioch. This isn't even possible. The word Christian didn't exist until the 1200s AD CE. 1200 years after the fact, you get the word Christian. And somehow they were called Christians 1200 years earlier when the word didn't exist. See, this is, but it was Cristiano. Okay, I'll give you Cristiano. But Eusebius, the writer of church history, in the first quarter-ish, it was between the first quarter and the middle of the 300s AD, 300 CE. That's when he wrote the book. He said they'd never used that word before. Yeah, Eusebius's church history, his ecclesia history, his ecclesiasticon history, because that's what they call it. It was not called the church. That word didn't exist in his lifetime. But by putting the word church in this book, that's supposed to be a translation of a book written in the 1st century. We take a word from the 12th century, we put it in the book, then what happens? Everybody in the Western world believes that there's such thing as a 1st century church, and there is no such thing. They think that people were actually called Christians at Antioch. That never happened, at least not in that time period. It's not even possible. They were called the Mashiach, the Mashihim in plural, the followers of Messiah, Mashiach. Hear it? Mashihim. That's what they were actually called. But you see what happens? We've changed history. This is why it's so important that you have the information, because then you have that information, you read this stuff, you can distinguish the truth from the false, the information that's false. All right. Our next word is tachbulot, which is wise counsel. It's a rule of government, especially that of a state, the art of governing, hence prudent counsel. It's from the root haval, which is to tighten a cord, to twist, and thus to bind. Properly tying or binding, poetically used of a cord. Okay, I need to talk about two things here. It says rule and government, especially that of a state. Again, they didn't have states back then. The art of governing, hence prudent counsel. Okay, first thing you have to know, the Bible is a Jewish book. It's written in its entirety by Jews. Oh, what about Luke? He was a Greek. No, he wasn't. The whole idea that Luke was a Greek is based on one thing and one thing only. The word Luke is a Greek word. It's a Greek name. That's what they base it on. He was a physician. He was a Greek physician. No, he wasn't. He was a Jewish doctor of the law, not a physician. It's the same word, by the way, in Greek. A physician and a doctor of the law, same word. Stop and think about it. In this time period, if you know anything about the customs, the culture, and the history, you know that the Jews, under no circumstances, would have listened to the teaching of a Gentile. Under no circumstances would they have done that. There are no circumstances where that would have taken place in that time period. None. Plus, this is a man that gives you details about the inner workings of the temple that only a Levite would have known. Only a Levite, a Jew. a priest. There's no other way that he would have known this. That ought to tell you something. Then if you look up the word Luke in Greek, you see that it means light bearer. Well, if you know anything about Hebrew, what's that make you think of? Aharon, the one they call Aaron, light bearer. His name was Aharon, and it was changed by somebody after the fact. Maybe to separate him from the other Aharon that was so popular, so famous, to cause less confusion. It would make sense that they would do that. Or maybe it was because Constantine, in his letter on Pesach, told everybody to utterly and completely separate themselves from Judaism, or he would come to them with his army. Yes, that's in his letter. It's very subtle. You have to read between the lines, but trust me, it's there. He threatened them with military force if they didn't change it, which is why the Jews bless God after their meal by raising when they pray, they raise their faces to the sky and their hands are open palms to the sky. And so what did the Catholic diocese do? Bow your head, put your hands together. The Jews bless after the meal. What do the diocese do? We'll pray before. In the Jewish blessing, it said, "Blessed are you, O Lord." So in the Catholic uh, version, it was, "Bless us, O Lord." It was a complete and utter perversion. So when we look at this, we have to realize these were all Jews. The only religion they were talking about was Judaism. And whether it's a Judaism, a sect of Judaism called the Mashiachim, who actually follow after the 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 idea that Yeshua is the Mashiach, that doesn't change anything. It's still Judaism. There is no such thing as the church. Yeshua did not come to start something new. He said he came to restore something very old, but the translators changed it. Okay, so when they talk about the art of governing, they're talking about the art of following the Torah, governing according to the Torah. And if it's according to the Torah, hence, it's prudent counsel. Had to go a long way to get there, but that's what you have to know. And so when it says haval, you have to know that in Hebrew, roots that talk about twisting and binding and being the cords of a rope, there's plenty of Hebrew verbs that do this. This is the idea of strength that comes uh, through layers, not so much of a whole bunch of stuff, but through layers. And the reason why they use it with a rope is if you take three small strings, say the size of a hair, and you put them in your hand, then pull real hard, you'll break them, right? But if you start twisting those things together, you add more and you add more and you add, pretty soon you got a rope that you're not going to be able to pull apart between your hands. And that's the whole idea. It's the strength that comes by the piling on, and your strength in your walk with God will come from the piling on and the twisting and the binding together of your knowledge of the Torah, because the Torah is life. Everything else is death. And so if you want to be strong, this is where you're going to have to go. Important to know. Our next word is yikne, which is will attain, if you will. It's to set up, to stand upright. It's of foundation. It's of creation. It's to acquire for oneself, to obtain, to possess, to be the owner of something, especially if someone to purchase. It's to redeem, as in people out of captivity. All right, so here's my amplified translation. Remember, we're on the parable, chapter 1, verse 5. Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 5. Meshalim, parable. Wisdom, skill, knowledge, and a steadfast mind hears with his ears, understands with a whole heart and mind, and obeys. Acts upon, obeys. Increasing in doctrine, knowledge, and instruction, with an attentive mind, and through distinction, discernment, and perception with his eyes, hearing with his ears, touching, he acquires for himself prudent counsel. All right. So let's look at something from the Sepharim Shelahim. That's what the uninitiated call the New Testament. In the letter to the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 5, it starts off with kai, which is the Greek word for and. This is pan, which is all, and all. Then it says uphoma, which is used in place of the Hebrew word ramam. It's a high thing. It's a lofty thing. It'd be from the Hebrew root room, which is to lift up oneself, to rise, to arise. Metaphorically, the heart is lifted up. Speaking of pride, eyes are lifted up. It's still lofty. It's still pride. To show oneself powerful, to triumph over anyone, to be exalted, to become high, used of a way which is cast up, metaphorically to become powerful, to be extolled with praises, to be high, lofty, especially used of those who are eminent in power and glory, or he who is eminent in power and glory. Our next word in Greek is epairomenon, which is in place of the Hebrew word nasa. It's to lift up, to bear up. A good example is in Bereshit, or Genesis 7:17. The waters increased and bore up the ark. So it wasn't God did not reach down with his hands and lift the ark up, right? The waters increased and the water lifted the ark up. Of course, it was caused by God. So in an idiomatic world, you could say God lifted it up with his hands if he wanted to, because you're speaking idiomatically. But it's literally the water that lifted the boat up off the ground. So there's your asa, there's your lifting up, the idea for that. To lift up one's head, used of one who is cheerful and merry. To lift up the head of anyone from prison is to cause them to go out of prison, which of course in their time was underground. To lift up one's own countenance, used of a person of someone who was down, who's, you're making them happy, you're cheering them up. Then in Greek, the next word is kata, which is all in Hebrew. It's against. When anything is put on the upper part of another so as to stand on it or lie upon it. It's like a foundation. You pour the foundation and then you stand the building on top of it. It's that idea. It's used of motion, especially when it's rapid, to or toward anyone or any place. Rushing, being more swift or rapid when it's going downhill. Upon or towards is the general use of this word. So it's upon. Then it says taste in Greek, which is the definite article, the word the for us. Then it says gnosis, like gnostic. Gnosis, here at Gnostic, then where you get the gnosis, the knowledge. That's from the Hebrew word da'at. It's knowing, the knowledge of a person, intelligence, understanding, wisdom, to be possessed of wisdom. Remember, that's going to have to be built on knowledge, right? You can't be wise without knowledge. We've already established that. It's from the root yada. Remember, Seinfeld did a whole show on yada, 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 and they always do that with their hand, yada, yada, yada. To see and hence to perceive, to acquire knowledge, to know, to be acquainted. The signification both of seeing and knowing, to know, to perceive, to be aware of, whether by the eyes or by the touch, often by the mind. Does it sound familiar? It ought to. To get to know, to discover, whether by seeing or hearing, to know by experience, to become acquainted with someone, of a man knowing a woman, to know, to be acquainted. And understand this, when it says of a man knowing a woman, yes, it can be that intimate thing, but it's when you have come together as a married couple, after some time goes by, you know her better than she knows herself. She knows you better than you know yourself. You can finish each other's sentences. This is what they're really talking about. Of a man knowing, you really know that person, because you have a face-to-face relationship with that person. Then they have the Greek word tau. There is no use of this word expressed or implied in the Hebrew language. There's no use for it. I had a person come to me one time. She just started, she'd just gone back to school. She was going to get her master's degree. And she was studying a little Hebrew. Well, she had a teacher there teaching Hebrew that didn't speak Hebrew. He was from the Middle East, but he was Arab. And so they were learning some things, and they came across this. They were looking at this sentence, and they had the and this and if and was and all these little bitty words, right? And she was telling me that he told her that these were they were implied, that they were part of the sentence, and I said, no, they're not. Well, she never spoke to me again, because her professor, he had to know more than I did. Forget that I spoke it. And their professor didn't. He was in the college. I wasn't. He must know all things. And she never spoke to me again after that. But these words are not expressed and implied. Um, if the definite article should be there, it is there. But it's rarely ever needed. You don't need the word the in Hebrew. You really don't. You don't, because you can use the word et instead. It has no meaning, but you can use it instead of the definite article. But you don't really need the definite article. The word the does not have to be in a sentence. Of doesn't have to be in a sentence unless it comes from the word uh, mean in Hebrew. Maybe they've attached a mem to the front of the word. Then you should probably put it in there. You don't have to. It's not necessary. In Hebrew, you don't need these words. In English, you do. But if you're truly going to understand Hebrew, I say forget them. Forget about expressed and implied words. There's no such thing. If you're truly going to understand Hebrew, leave them out of your understanding. You don't need them. That's all I wanted to say about that. The next word, of course, is theou, which is in place of the Hebrew word Elohim. It's our English word God. You understand that this is a generic word. They use the word Elohim in the Bible of false gods. They did. They even called angels Elohim in a couple of places, and they even called human beings Elohim, because they were, if you were a king, they tended to call you Elohim. If you were a man of high stature, somebody like Job that was rich and was very highly thought of in his neighborhood, it would not be uncommon for people to call him Elohim, because it's not that they're trying to make him the God, or the one and only God. No, it's just that was an expression. It was like we say sir. It really is on that level. So this whole idea of taking the word Elohim and leaving part of the word out and putting a minus sign, it's so stupid. First off, it's not God's name. And second off, it's a generic word used to false gods. Anyway. And then, of course, the last one is Kai, which is the last one for now, is Kai, which is, again, the word for and. But before we move on to and finish this, I want to move to some stuff about basic psychology. When people feel shame, what is that? It's the belief that we are basically bad. And that begins in infancy. If you have a problem with this, if you struggle with thinking that you or humans in general are basically bad, that began in your infancy. And it happens to people who were neglected, shamed, or abused in some way. Now, because these children did not know that their parents didn't know how to properly love them, they conclude that they were the cause of the abuse. They were defective, inadequate, unworthy, or unlovable. These children develop what is called core shame. It's my fault. They don't love me. I'm worthless. That came from your childhood. Some of them then try to make things right and hope that if they are good enough and do things right enough, they will be lovable. Let's talk about disappointment. Disappointment is self-inflicted as well. It comes because we've created an image in our mind that wasn't accurate, a false image of a desired reality. If I expect if my battery is dying, it won't recharge, and I expect to get in my car tomorrow morning and it to start, I'm probably going to experience disappointment because I've set myself up for that, right? I have an expectation that's not realistic. It almost always comes from unrealistic expectations. Even when it comes from somebody else. Somebody tells you that they're going to be there at 10 o'clock sharp, you can count on me, and they don't show up. You having that unrealistic expectation that that person's going to keep their word will set you up for disappointment, right? Anyway, bitterness is a much more intense form of disappointment because we were counting or depending on something that failed to happen. Regret is deep and painful sorrow for wrongdoing, right? This is all common stuff. We all know this. Embarrassment causes us to feel self-conscious or ill at ease. Also, shame we feel when our inadequacy and or guilt is made public. We call that embarrassment. Condemnation is the condition of feeling strongly disapproved of, feeling guilty, a feeling of strong disapproval, feeling something we did was wrong or sinful. Still, it's these things they come from within us. This is self-inflicted. Guilt is knowing that you have committed an offense or wrong morally or spiritually, feeling responsible for an offense, whether real or imagined. You can feel guilty for something you're not even guilty of. Pride, of course, is a high opinion of one's own dignity, importance, merit, or superiority, whether as cherished in the mind or as displayed in conduct. Humiliation is a state of disgrace or loss of self-respect, strong feelings of embarrassment, and an instance in which we are accused. Oh, good God. I'm just making it up now. I don't even know where that's coming from. An instance in which we are caused to lose our prestige or self-respect. And so we call that humiliation. Fear is a distressing emotion brought on by impending danger, evil, pain, etc., whether real or imagined. Because you know you can imagine things and scare yourself, right? If that weren't true, scary movies would not be so popular. Anger, well, that's fury, it's indignation, it's rage. It implies strong feelings aroused by injury, feelings of injustice, feelings of being wronged, etc. Anger is the general term for a sudden violent displeasure. A burst of anger, indignation, implies deep and justified anger or unjustified indignation at cruelty or against corruption. Rage is vehement anger. Rage at being frustrated. Fury is rage. So is rage so great that it resembles insanity. All right, so getting back to our verse. Ix malotizontes is the next Greek word. It is used in place of shivi. It's of captivity. It's to go, to be led into captivity, captives, to be led away captivity. So somebody comes and puts you in a Chevy and just kidding. The root word here is shabbat. It's to take or lead away captive, whether persons or flocks or wealth. Just Genesis 31:26 says, captives of the sword. So they were taken in war. They're spoils of the war, right? They've been taken captive. Our next word is pawn. We've already had that. That's all. It's totality. And then it's noema, which is being in Hebrew. It's from our earlier word navon, which was to distinguish, to separate. It's that knowledge that is earned and learned. Ace is our next word. It's used in place of the Hebrew word el, which is to. I turn to the east, or I turn to the west, right? It's to. It's properly of motion. Then it's tain, which is the definite article, the word the to us. Then it's upakoen, and they use that in place of the word shama. Hear with the ears, understand with the whole heart and mind, to act upon. That's what the word is here. We have tau, which is that word that has no meaning expressed or implied here. And then we have Christou. Christou. See, there's Christ. It goes all the way back to the Bible. No, no, no. They use this word in place of Mashiach. And they did that because the pagans had no idea what a Messiah was. They had no idea what Mashiach meant. And so when they started transliterating Mashiach as Messias, and you'll find that in a place here or there among the translations of the New Testament, Messias. But the Greeks didn't have any clue. The Hellenized Jews that read this did not have any clue what that was. So they said, well, the Mashiach is the Christou. He's the anointed one. Oh, now that we can wrap our heads around. The anointed one. They use this word Christou, it was used of shields, because when the shields were made of leather, you see it in the movies. They set the end of the arrows on fire and they shoot them, and at night they call them night arrows. Or what was that? Isn't that what they called them, Donna? Night arrows. And they would those may have been the ones they didn't light up, but they would light them up, right? They'd be fire and they shoot them. Well, when you have a leather sword and the fire hits that sword or shield, when the fire hits the shield, what's going to happen to the shield, right? If it's made out of leather. Well, they discovered that if you douse that shield in oil, if you anoint it with oil, the fire will go out. It seems very counterintuitive, doesn't it? It seems like you put the fire there, and the fire hits the oil, it's going to burn. But it didn't do that. They anointed their shields with oil so that it wouldn't burn. So anyway, it was the pouring of oil over something. It's from the root mashach, which is to stroke, to draw the hand over anything, to spread over with anything, especially to lay colors on anything. Still doesn't make sense, does it? Especially to anoint with oil, a shield, by doing which the leather becomes more tenacious and less pervious to weapons. That's what they're saying, is that less chance of fire. Especially to anoint anyone as a sacred rite in his inauguration and consecration to an office, as of the priest, the high priest, the prophet, the king. They were always anointed in the Hebrew world, right? So they called the Mashiach, to make the pagans understand what Mashiach was. They called him in Greek Christou, so they would know he was the anointed one. Okay, so here's my amplified translation of this 2 Corinthians 10:5. Everything that is lifted up, lofty, exalted, and proud, that is lifted up in its own strength, standing firmly against perceiving and acquiring knowledge and wisdom through sight, sound, and touch, by discovery, experience, and face-to-face relationship with God, therefore bring back into captivity the totality of all discernment and perception with the eyes, hearing, and touch, turning them toward hearing with our physical ears, understanding with our whole hearts, and obedience of Messiah. So that really doesn't make sense, right? But that's the amplified version. Here's the literal. In every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and enslaving every thought to the obedience of Mashiach. Still not sure you follow? The words casting down imaginations. Remember that? That's what this started off with, casting down imaginations. So people go around for the last 2,000 years telling you that you cast down your imaginations and give them over to Messiah. But casting down imaginations isn't even in the Greek text. Somebody added it, trying to make it where it would make sense to the reader. But the person who did it was a doofus, didn't know what he was talking about. Why is this important? Well, because you can't cast down what's already in your head. It's already there. As long as you have an enemy, you will be attacked by these thoughts and imaginations. If it's already there, you can't cast them down. What are you to do then? Well, what did it tell you to do? Listen to, understand with your whole heart and mind, and act upon, obey only your Mashiach. What did he say to do? Well, he told us to study, which was led by a qualified instructor, in case you didn't catch that in all of this, and increase your knowledge and your doctrine of God. Right? That's what he just told us to do. It's the only way you can be sure that your doctrine, information, and understanding about God is correct. Nothing else is real. If you get caught up in trying to control your thoughts will control you. Don't believe me? Try to control your weight. Right? I mean, that happens to everybody. The more you concentrate, the more effort you put into losing weight, the more likely you are to gain weight. Right? You cannot make weight loss the center of your world. Because while you may be successful for a while, after a while, it's going to catch up with you. If you get busy learning everything you can, always increasing your knowledge of Him, you will find rest from your thoughts. Will they go away? Never. But they will get fewer and further between. These things that torment you, that make you feel bad, that make you feel less than adequate and all that, it'll be fewer and further apart. Why? Well, because you'll be too busy learning about God to spend your time on those little thoughts. It works. So get busy thinking, understanding, and obeying Mashiach, and let those thoughts, the thinking, the understanding of Mashiach, let those thoughts control your heart. Shalom, shalom.